The Dudley Branch Library will host a celebration of poetry and a historic figure on the Boston Police Department. That figure is the department's first African-American police officer named Horatio Homer. And to tell us more about the connection between the history and the poetry are the president of the Friends of the Dudley Branch Library, Sarah Ann Shaw, and the records manager and archivist from the Boston Police Department, Margaret Sullivan. Thank you both for much being with us.
Pleased to be here, Chris.
I'm starting with Sarah Ann Shaw. This sounds like a strange thing, the police beat and the poetry beat in the same place.
Well, not really, because April is Poetry Month. And who better to come talk about poetry than Sam Cornish, who is the poet laureate for the city of Boston, the first African-American poet laureate. And at Dudley Library, the Friends Group, we try to do things that will educate the community and beyond the community about things that are going on. And what's wrong with poetry? Right. Many people write poetry, read poetry, and this is a way of encouraging young people to learn more about not only their history, but about poetry.
And of course, we're also talking about, maybe in the example provided by Sam Cornish, a poet who has found inspiration in the story of Officer Homer, right?
Yes, he has written a poem which he's going to dedicate to Sergeant Homer. And I haven't heard the poem yet, but I'm sure it'll be marvelous because he does wonderful, wonderful poetry, and he's a wonderful poet. So he will do some of his own, and then the poem that he's dedicating to Sergeant Homer.
Margaret Sullivan, you're the archivist. You more or less, after all these years of no one really even bringing this up or even knowing it, you discovered Sergeant Homer. How did that happen?
There was a reference in an 1880s book to a, quote, first colored officer appointed with no name. And by using records that exist in the library, comparing payroll and census, city payroll and census, I was able to identify one man as African American. Once we had the name, Horatio J. Homer, I could track him. He served 40 years, appointed in 1878. He was promoted to sergeant. He was a Renaissance man. He loved music and poetry. Served with distinction, knew many prominent African Americans, and it's very meaningful to me that Sam Cornish, who has written so much beautiful and meaningful poetry, often based on actual events in African American history, has decided to include Sergeant Homer.
Now you're talking about a time in the 1800s, I would guess, before we had civil service. So how did he end up being this first African American officer in the police department?
There are two things that seem to have come together. One was that there was an African-American member of the Common Council, which is the precursor to the current City Council, John J. Smith, a very prominent abolitionist, a friend of Charles Sumner, a businessman. And when he was elected to the Common Council, he said, "It is high time we have an officer of color." At the same time, the old police chief system was ended, and there was an appointed board of police commissioners. One of those, Henry Sturgis Russell, had served in the Civil War as head of the 5th Mass Cavalry, a black regiment. He was cousin to Robert Gould Shaw. He had worked with black men in uniform.
Sarah, did you find this fascinating about the story about how you actually got on, and just the networking of these different parts of society?
Oh, I certainly did. Miss Sullivan got in touch with me last year and asked me, did I know about Horatio Homer? I said, no, I don't. And so she said, she filled me in, and she asked, would the Friends of Dudley Library be interested in sponsoring something about Sergeant Homer? And so MAMLIO, which is the Massachusetts Association of Minority Law Enforcement Officers, and the Friends of Dudley Library, we sponsored a program that on a Saturday afternoon at the library, and Miss Sullivan came, and a wonderful slide presentation and a verbal presentation about Sergeant Homer. And it's always fascinating to find out things about your own city that you didn't know before. And so that's why we decided for Poetry Month that we would go further and have Sam Cornish and have the presentation about Sergeant Homer again. And people are always amazed when they find out. They say, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Oh, gee whiz. So I thought it would be, the Friends thought it would be a really good thing to do. You know, at the Friends of Dudley Library, we're doing poetry. We also have jazz concerts that happen like once every 2 or 3 months in the evening at the library. And we try to do things that bring joy and education to the people in Roxbury.
Turning back to Margaret Sullivan, even the first Irish-American police officer encountered a good deal of prejudice. So you would wonder about Officer Homer. He must have encountered that somewhere.
I believe he did. The question is what is recorded. And I did find one story of a criminal arrested and brought to headquarters in custody. And when he saw Sergeant Homer, a black man wearing sergeant stripes, he lunged at him and tried to attack him. And the other officers restrained him. And the criminal said, "I would kill him if I could to see a black man in that uniform."
All right, Sarah, as far as knowing this story and knowing other things about Officer Homer, his ability to recommend other people on the police department, of course, it looks, what do people take from that? Does that change their sense of things, really?
Well, I think that when people find out about Sergeant Homer, I think they're more amazed, they're more really surprised that there was an African-American police officer on the force in 1800s. I don't know that it makes them think that, oh, this was the beginning of something wonderful and everything was sweetness and light. But it is it's a nugget of information that they can use, and maybe I would hope that it would propel people to want to do more digging, find out who else did something that we don't know about. What other African American did something that we didn't know about? I mean, nowadays, young people don't seem to have as much of an interest in history. But when you hear about someone like Sergeant Homer, they say, oh, maybe there's something else I need to know. You know, there was a wonderful ceremony in Brighton when a headstone was placed on Sergeant Homer's grave, because his grave there was no headstone. And he was buried right not too far from here. And it was well attended, and people who were there who didn't know were saying, oh, I didn't know that. So I think that, you know, the connections that people start to make as they find out information sometimes takes you to one place, to another place, to another place. And for me, even though I've heard the presentation, I'm sure that the second time when we're doing the program on the 30th from 1 to 4, I have to plug the date and the time, April 30th, 1 to 4, Dudley Branch Library. I'm sure that I'll find out something new about Sergeant Homer that I didn't really dwell upon the first time I heard Ms. Sullivan's presentation.
Great. Thank you both very much for being with us. From the Friends of the Dudley Branch Library, Sarah Ann Shaw. From the Boston Police Department, Margaret Sullivan. We'll have more news in just a moment.